Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into part 4 of our 5-part deep dive on the Manistee Fire Department, focusing strictly on the mechanics of whistleblower retaliation and the true cost of speaking up. In our previous sessions, we mapped out the governance and operational structures, but today, we're stripping all of that away to look purely at the labor dynamics. We're going to examine exactly how internal cultures handle dissent, how completely standard administrative processes can be flipped totally upside down, and what actually happens when public servants try to sound the alarm on safety issues.
To keep things moving, here is our roadmap for today. First, the cost of speaking up. Second, weaponized progressive discipline. Third, shielding the whistleblower. And finally, the ultimate price of retaliation.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the cost of speaking up and how the stage is set for suppression. So before retaliation can even happen, right, the soil has to be prepped. A specific organizational environment really has to take root. The documents show a super clear shift here. We see a move away from what we'd call a collaborative, just culture, where frontline folks are actually encouraged to point out systemic flaws for the sake of community safety. Instead, they pivot hard toward an environment heavily focused on narrative control and, frankly, anti-union animus. It's like suddenly protecting the department's image matters way more than fixing underlying safety hazards. And when that happens, anyone waving a red flag is just immediately viewed as a threat. And how exactly do they enforce that control? Well, take a look at directives like Policy 104.4.G. It's a memo that literally bans staff from identifying as department members on social media. Now, I know what you're thinking. Social media policies are pretty standard for organizations. But in this specific context, it basically acts as a massive overbroad gag order. It completely shuts down the ability of these public employees to warn their own community about a culture of safety neglect. It creates this totally isolated little bubble where internal problems are just kept firmly in the dark. Moving right along to Section 2, weaponized progressive discipline, and the anatomy of how this process actually works. Okay, so to really grasp how standard HR tools get corrupted, we first need to talk about a Loudermill hearing. If you're not familiar, this originates from a Supreme Court case, and it's basically a standard due process right. It guarantees that before a public employee is fired or seriously disciplined, they get to actually hear the charges against them and respond. It is literally designed to be a protective shield for the employee, but as we're about to see, even a shield can be used as a weapon if you swing it hard enough. Now, in labor law, timing is absolutely everything. It creates what's known as a temporal proximity alert. Check this out. For 7 entire weeks, this completely unresolved, relatively minor infraction is just sitting dormant on a manager's desk, gathering dust. Then, on April 15th, an employee sends an email to a state representative raising concerns about public safety. And wouldn't you know it, on that exact same day, that dormant 7-week-old infraction is magically brought back to life and a written warning is issued out of nowhere. The very next day, a Loudermill disciplinary hearing notice follows. It is wild. They basically took a dead administrative issue and weaponized it, the literal second an employee engaged in protected whistleblower activity. And the craziest part, management didn't just discipline the employee using that old revived charge, they went a step further and actually put their real motive in writing. Seriously, the April 16th disciplinary notice explicitly calls out the employee's email to a state lawmaker. They categorize the act of raising safety concerns as political activity and, get this, loafing. They didn't even try to hide the fact that the discipline was punishment for speaking out. They documented the whole thing, handing over direct written evidence of a causal link between an employee's protected activity and management's retaliatory discipline. So looking at this completely undeniable, documented sequence of events, you really have to ask yourself a critical question. How exactly does the law protect employees when standard discipline processes are totally weaponized against them? Like, if management can just hijack the progressive discipline track to force out anyone who dares to speak up, what safeguards actually exist to maintain the integrity of our public services? That brings us right to Section 3, shielding the whistleblower and the statutory guardrails in place. Thankfully, the law doesn't just leave public servants completely defenseless here. The main statutory shield is the Michigan Whistleblowers Protection Act, specifically MCL 15362. This law makes it 100% illegal to retaliate against an employee for reporting or even just being about to report safety deficiencies to a public official. So writing an employee up and threatening their livelihood specifically because they emailed a state rep, that is the exact scenario this statute was built to stop. It's a hard legal boundary meant to ensure that the people protecting the public are actually protected themselves. But wait, there's more.
Alongside whistleblower protections, our source documents show employees using another really critical tool: unfair labor practice grievances, or ULPs. A ULP is a formal legal claim used to fight back against documented patterns of anti-union animus, retaliatory discipline, or when management just refuses to bargain in good faith. By filing these ULPs, employees are taking this toxic labor dynamic and putting it on the official legal record. It completely shifts the dispute out of the realm of an internal shouting match and forces an objective, structured legal review. And finally, let's dive into Section 4, the price of retaliation and the systemic consequences of all this. So what actually happens when these labor disputes just fester and go unresolved? Well, during public testimony at City Council, someone described this exact dynamic perfectly. They called it attrition, defining it as the act of weakening or exhausting by constant harassment, abuse, or attack. Think about that for a second. Staffing reductions in these kinds of environments, they aren't just natural turnover. When an organization constantly attacks the people trying to speak up, employees don't just leave for a better paycheck. They are worn down, totally stressed out, and driven away by a relentless administrative assault. It is literally an active purging of anyone who prioritizes safety over protecting the narrative. And this strategy of attrition? It carries massive operational consequences. When you push out all your experienced personnel through this weaponized discipline, you aren't just losing their institutional knowledge. You are leaving a much smaller team to handle the exact same amount of high-stress work. That leads straight to systemic fatigue. And let me tell you, in emergency response, systemic fatigue is a recipe for an incredibly high level of operational risk. Errors skyrocket, response times suffer, and at the end of the day, the community is just fundamentally less safe. Then, you have to look at the final toll, the actual material liabilities stacking up against the municipality. Honestly, the financial and legal risks here are just staggering. First, you've got actionable whistleblower violations, which can trigger absolutely massive lawsuits. Then you have the ongoing ULP filings that require super expensive legal defense. And on top of all that, the brutal financial cost of trying to recruit, hire, and train replacements for the highly qualified staff you just actively pushed out the door. Taxpayer money that absolutely should be going toward public safety and better equipment is instead just bleeding out to cover legal bills and sky-high turnover. So, I want to leave you with this provocative final thought to consider regarding municipal governance. When the people who speak out to protect their community are forced out through retaliation, who is ultimately paying the price? Spoiler alert, it's not just the employee losing their job. It's the taxpayers footing all those legal bills, and it's the community members who are left relying on a depleted, completely exhausted, and silenced department. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for part 4 of this Explainer series, and I will see you in part 5 as we wrap up our deep dive into these source documents.